Hello, comrades. So today we are talking about the 1843 three-star Christmas classic, A Christmas Carol, and how it's actually really weird. And to really kind of conceptualize this, I'd like to bring up a scale I have for Christmas stories. It is the How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Charlie Brown Christmas story scale. So on the one hand, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which is not about Christianity, doesn't really mention Christianity at all. There aren't any churches. There really is no religious affiliation. There is a single reference to Saint Nick with Saint in his name. But in general, not really a Christian story, just a story that happens to be about a predominantly Christian holiday. That's like a 1 on this scale. On the other end of the scale, we have Charlie Brown, which is about a boy who's disillusioned with modern practices and the commercialization of Christmas. He kind of discovers the real meaning of Christmas, which for him is a religious one. You know, they read the Bible. It's explicitly a Christian story. That's a 10. So A Christmas Carol, our 1800 story, is like a 2.5. And I thought that was really interesting. So what I mean by this is it's about Christmas. It's set in our world, a world in which Christmas is a Christmas holiday, a Christian holiday, I should say. This is referenced. So like Scrooge is, we all know the story, right? You know, Scrooge is a horribly greedy man, and he doesn't want to celebrate Christmas, and that's terrible. And so the three ghosts come to him, and they show him his past, how he used to be innocent, how he was corrupted, his present, how everyone kind of hates him and he's miserable, and there are people who are suffering, but also there are people who are very happy because it's Christmas and this is the joy he could have in his life and his future when he dies alone and unloved. And so his nephew, who's, trying to convince him to celebrate Christmas at the very beginning of this book, references that it is a Christian holiday. There's a church, there's a church bell that tells you the time, but it's mostly like a cultural thing. It does reference that people go to church. Now, if this were purely a non-magical story, if this were a materialistic story, I wouldn't think much of it. You can make a Christian story without it containing, miracles from God. That's fine. The interesting thing, though, is that it's not just like a materialistic story. There are ghosts, which, on just like a very basic level, is kind of in conflict with Christianity, So in most forms of Christianity, you go to heaven or hell, or, maybe they have something else, but they don't really have ghosts. They don't have something like his old business partner who has to wander the earth because it says a soul has to wander the earth, it has to go around, and if you don't do this in life, you're just stuck doing this. And he's chained, and he's chained up with his deeds and records of his material possessions, and he talks about how he basically chained himself up of his own will, and how he's still kind of chained in his own will. I don't know what to make about it. Maybe there is redemption for ghosts within the story. It's hard to tell. Maybe this is part of his redemption. It does mention that of the ghosts, that Scrooge recognized many of them, which suggests that they aren't really ghosts for all eternity. And so maybe you could kind of fit this into some kind of redemption concept, a purgatorial type system. But there are also the ghosts of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future, which are, I don't know how to put this in a purely Christian framework, because there are people who died. They are spirits. They're kind of pagan in that sense. What I found really interesting was the ghost of Christmas present, which starts out young and gets older and older as the day goes on, which is kind of this very temporal existence. It is very much not tied to a human life. And so, I don't know, maybe you'd have to reinterpret them as angels or something. But if they were angels, the book could have just said this. This is an external reinterpretation of the book that we are placing onto it. It is not an inherent part of the book. And I think the part I found most interesting is when, at the very end, when Scrooge, is about to go back, when he's in his future, and he doesn't like that. He wants to be a better person. He's redeemed. He doesn't say that he's going to be a good Christian, that he's going to honor God or Jesus Christ or anything like that. And the morals in this book I think the morals are pretty simple and straightforward, but they do fit within a broadly Christian framework. Don't be too greedy, don't accumulate too much wealth, which I think is something you could justify within most Christian frameworks. It's pretty explicitly, said by just, that you should give up your material possessions, even if some Christians don't particularly like that. And it is about redemption, which I think is a theme in a lot of Christian works and within Christianity itself. But he doesn't say that. He says that he will honor Christmas. Christmas itself is the magical thing. It's not about God. That's a happy ending. He doesn't become a good Christian. He just becomes someone with Christmas in his heart. And so I'm thinking about this. And I'm sure there are plenty of ways to interpret this book as any book. But it really does feel like a way of taking these values, which could be understood in a Christian framework, that, you have Scrooge, he's a bad character because he's just focused on avoiding poverty, avoiding pain, and accumulating wealth. He doesn't use that wealth in any meaningful way. He doesn't help people, he doesn't form a family, he doesn't have friends, he doesn't give to charity, and something I found kind of interesting is he doesn't even spend the wealth on himself. He is miserable. He's kind of his own worst victim. In a way, there isn't an explicit victim from his inaction besides him. He isn't hurt, or the people who work for him, obviously. But I think within the framework of the story, it really is set up to show how he is hurting himself, how he is damaging himself, making himself miserable. And if he just becomes a better person, has just a little bit more Christmas in his heart, he'll be good. And the text seems to portray Christmas as its own thing. It's completely separate from Christianity, and so to me it feels like a claiming of certain values which might historically be associated with Christianity, and saying no, those aren't Christian values. They're just kind of broader cultural values. That happens a lot. I think with Christmas, Christmas is not in the Bible. It's a cultural practice associated with Christians and often connected to the people who may have just recently became Christian, may have had other traditions, who may be bringing other traditions on top of that. And I think it often gets very confused because it is very common to have other celebrations around the end of the year and the winter solstice and all that. So when I read this book, it almost feels like it's taking Christianity, it's taking what it perceives to be the good values of charity, compassion, having friends and family, and saying, yeah, do that. But conspicuously without mentioning any of the bad parts. And this, to me, feels like the opposite of what many Christians do. We'll take a look at Christianity, and I think they tend to ignore a lot of what Jesus had to say, and they'll focus a lot on what Paul had to say. When they talk about how they don't like gay marriage, they'll reference Paul, but they'll never talk about loving your neighbor, or being good to foreigners, or like he who is without sin cast the first stone. And it feels like they're kind of taking the values of kindness, they're taking that out of Christianity. But this feels like the opposite. It feels like taking the values of Christianity and taking them out and keeping them, but kind of leaving Christianity. Anyways, I give it 3 stars. I think it might just because I am so very familiar with the story. It wasn't new, it wasn't shocking, I'd read this before as a child, but we all know the story because for whatever reason, and perhaps this is the reason, perhaps the reason A Christmas Carol is adapted into, all the TV specials, you've seen it, so many versions of it, is because it is not so obviously Christian. It is easier to put into a framework. And I did find this interesting. Someone who grew up celebrating Christmas but not really being Christian, I found the story to be relatable in that way. That there is something magical in Christmas itself, outside of the religion. Perhaps it is just a cultural value. any cultural practice with so much significance will become important. But anyways, this story was written in like the 1800s, so there were a ton of words I had to look up. So there's ironmangery, which is ironware, stuff you buy from an iron manger. There's assign, as in a noun. So I knew the verb assign, obviously, to assign something to someone, but an assign would be an assignee, someone who's been assigned something. There's legatee, which is someone who's receiving a legacy or an inheritance. There's rhyme, so Rime, which is like a film, or like as in a covering of something, like a kind of a mucusy is what how I imagined it. I don't think it has to be mucus specifically. There's heard by, which means near. There's proffer, which means to offer. There's ruddy, which means reddish. Garret, which is attic, I believe. Pelt, I knew pelt is in like the pelt of an animal, it's skin, but it means to move quickly in certain British dialects. Feign, now I knew to feign something, but to be feign to do something, for example, would be to be glad to do that thing. There's waggish, which means mischievous or mischievous, however you wish to pronounce that. Fetter, which means to restrain. I like this one because I am very familiar with the phrase, or the word I should say, unfetter or unfettered. But to fetter something means to restrain it. There's gird, which means to bind or prepare. Thanky, Scrooge says this a lot, means thank you. I like this. I think we should start saying thanky again instead of thanks. Continence, which I think is one of the more common words. I'm sure I've seen this a million times before, but I felt like looking it up. It means appearance. There's dirge, which I'm pretty sure has been in one of these lists before. It's a kind of mournful poem. Remonstrate, which means to object. Jocund, which means, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that well, jocund, which means jovial. There's a gainsay, which means deny. I think that's another one that's a little more common. I like this one, capacious. It means spacious. There's a negus, which is apparently a kind of drink made from wine. Scabbard, which is where the sword goes into. I was wondering if this is related to the word Excalibur, because Excalibur comes out of the rock. So it's like the rock is its scabbard. There's gratis, similar to the Spanish word gratis, meaning free. But in Spanish, it just means free as in it does not cost anything. However, in English, gratis is used free in both of the ways. Like, we use the word free, so it means free, not costing anything, but also, like, free to move about. There's filbert, which is not just the name of a story, the TV show within BoJack Horseman, but it's another word for hazelnut. There's a biffin, which is a kind of apple, but specifically it said Norfolk biffin, and apparently this kind of apple is popular in Norfolk, in England. And they have a kind of pastry associated with the apple, and so it would probably refer to that. Squab, which means fat or clumsy. There's furze, which means a kind of thorny evergreen shrub. And there's excrescence, which is an abnormal growth. Now, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and good potato.